The night was heavy with silence. It wrapped around Daniel like a thick blanket he couldn't shake off. He sat in his darkened living room, the TV glowing quietly in the background, sound turned down low, forgotten. Rain whispered against the windows, and the soft drip from the corner of the ceiling was the only real noise in the house. Everything else had grown still, lifeless, like his heart. It had been 3 months since he lost his wife, Emily. 3 months of waking up in a bed too big, of setting out 2 plates by habit, of reaching for someone who wasn't there. 3 months of cold coffee, unopened mail, and distant calls from friends that he ignored more often than not. He hadn't been a man prone to loneliness. He had always found meaning in his work, in his marriage, in Sunday barbecues and Tuesday date nights. He was a man of rhythm and routine. But now, time felt like a foreign concept, each hour dragging behind the last. The world kept spinning, but Daniel had been left behind. He stared at his phone on the table. He hadn't touched it all day. The screen was black, and the silence was loud. A part of him feared the noise it might bring, the cheerful check-ins, the forced condolences, the empty words that only widened the hollow space inside him. Still, something made him reach for it. His fingers trembled slightly as he picked it up. No missed calls, no messages. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or disappointed. He scrolled aimlessly through his contacts, stopping on Emily's name out of habit. He still hadn't deleted it, couldn't, not yet. Then, almost without thinking, he dialed a random number from the old contact list, someone he barely remembered from a conference years ago, a man named James NYC, minus 2018. He didn't even know why he still had the number. The line rang once, twice. Daniel almost hung up, but then, someone answered. Hello, came a soft, calm voice on the other end. Daniel hesitated. I think I dialed the wrong number. The voice chuckled gently. Wrong number or not, sometimes the right people come through at the wrong time. Daniel blinked. The voice was older, rich, warm, with the kind of weight that made you feel like someone had lived 1,000 lives. I'm sorry, Daniel said quickly, embarrassed. I'll let you go. No, wait, the voice replied kindly. If you needed to talk to someone, maybe you still can. I'm not in a hurry. Are you? Something about those words cracked something open in Daniel's chest. He hadn't talked to anyone in days, really talked. His throat tightened. I've had a hard time, he admitted, almost ashamed. There was a pause, but not the awkward kind. Just a thoughtful silence, like the man on the other end was opening a space for him. Tell me, the voice said. So Daniel did. He spoke without knowing why. Words tumbled out of him, cautious at first, then flowing faster. He spoke of Emily, of the way she laughed when she danced around the kitchen, the books she always meant to finish, the way she held his hand, like it was the safest place in the world. He talked about the hospital, the diagnosis, the slow decline. He talked about the guilt, the anger, the numbness, and the voice just listened. No interruptions, no cliches, just quiet understanding. Finally, Daniel asked, Why are you doing this? You don't even know me. The voice answered, Because someone once did the same for me. It saved my life. I never forgot. Daniel closed his eyes. He didn't cry, not yet, but his breathing changed, softer, a bit more free. Who are you? He asked. The voice smiled through the phone. My name is Michael. That's all that matters right now. Daniel and Michael talked for nearly an hour, about grief, about resilience, about how pain doesn't shrink, it just becomes easier to carry when someone else holds a piece of it with you. And by the end of the call, Daniel felt lighter, like someone had opened a window in a room that had been locked for far too long. When the call ended, Daniel stared at his phone again. This time, the silence felt different, not empty, just quiet. He didn't know it yet, but that one phone call would change everything. It was the beginning of something unexpected, something healing, something human, and neither Daniel nor Michael would ever be the same again.
The following morning, Daniel awoke with a strange sensation. Not joy, not peace exactly, but a kind of stillness. the first since Emily had passed. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long time, the early sunlight breaking gently through the curtains. He looked at the phone on his nightstand. The previous night's conversation still lingered like a faint scent of something beautiful that had passed through the room. He didn't expect to call again. It had been a fluke, a moment of weakness or maybe grace. Either way, he figured Michael had done his good deed and moved on. Still, Daniel found himself drawn to the idea that somewhere out there was a man who didn't know him, yet somehow understood the heaviness in his heart. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in faded oranges and purples, Daniel picked up his phone and called again. 1 ring, 2, 3. Then the familiar voice, "Daniel," Michael said warmly, like he'd been expecting the call. "I didn't know if you'd want to talk again?" Michael chuckled. "Some things don't need to be decided. They just happen, like the tide." And again, they spoke. This time, the conversation was lighter. They talked about memories from childhood Daniel's, love for camping, the way his father taught him to fish. Michael shared stories about riding trains across the Midwest in the 70s, how he once found work at a steel mill just to see what it was like, and how he'd spent a year living out of a van with nothing but a typewriter and some notebooks. "You were a writer?" Daniel asked, intrigued. "Still am," Michael said. "But I stopped publishing a long time ago. Got tired of turning pain into pages for other people to judge. Now, I write for myself, or sometimes for people like you." Daniel paused. "People like me?" Michael's voice softened. "People who need a story to remind them they're not alone." Over the next few weeks, their conversations became a ritual. Daniel found himself laughing again, sometimes even smiling without realizing it. He started taking small walks outside, cooking actual meals and opening the blinds in his lines. Living room. Each time the phone rang, it was like sunlight cutting through a dense fog. But something was changing in Daniel, too. He began asking questions not just about Michael's past, but about his present. "Where do you live, Michael?" Daniel asked one evening. "A little town in Nebraska," came the reply. "One of those places where the gas station clerk knows your dog's name and the mailman waves like your family. Sounds peaceful." It is, but peace can be lonely too. That line stuck with Daniel. There was something in Michael's voice that night, a note of weariness, a shadow. It wasn't sadness exactly, more like a distance. As though he'd spent a lifetime learning how to help others, but had forgotten how to help himself. "You ever talk to anyone besides me?" Daniel asked gently. Michael was quiet for a moment. Then, not for a long time. "There was someone, once, but I lost him." Daniel felt the weight of that answer settle over them both. He wanted to ask more, but didn't. Not yet the next morning. Daniel stood in front of the mirror, really shaving for the first time in weeks. He was surprised by the face staring back at him, still tired, still grieving, but alive, and slowly waking up to something more. That afternoon, he drove to the grocery store, waved at the cashier he'd ignored for months, and even picked up Emily's favorite tea just to have it in the house. Her memory was no longer a knife too. The heart, but a quiet echo that reminded him love, didn't die with the body. It lingered. When he returned home, he called Michael again. This time he asked, "Can I send you something? A letter, maybe?" Michael hesitated. "If you do, make sure it's honest. No pretending. People write what they think others want to hear. That's not what heals, I promise," Daniel said. And he meant it. As the days passed, Daniel wrote letters, not just to Michael, but to Emily, to himself. He poured out guilt and gratitude, in equal measure. And with every word, he felt less like a man grieving a past and more like a man building a future. But Daniel didn't know that. Michael's own heart was carrying wounds that never truly healed. And one night, as a storm raged outside and the phone line crackled with static, Michael's voice faltered. "I have to tell you something," he said, barely above a whisper. Daniel leaned forward. "What is it?" "Something about my past. Something I've never told anyone on the other end of the line. It's why I do this. Why I listen. Why I can't stop." And then the call dropped. The line went dead. Daniel stared at the phone, his heart pounding not with fear, but with a strange urgency, for the first time, he realized that maybe Michael wasn't just helping him heal. The call had ended so suddenly, so abruptly, that Daniel sat frozen in his chair, the dial tone echoing like a bell tolling in an empty chapel. He stared at the phone, uncertain whether to redial or wait, as if he might somehow sense when it was right to reach out again. He waited. Minutes passed. Then hours. Michael didn't call back that night, for the first time since their conversations had begun. Daniel felt the ache of absence not because of his own loss, but because someone else might be hurting. He'd spent weeks opening his heart to a stranger who listened, comforted, and never judged. And now, when it seemed like that stranger needed him, he didn't know what to do. The next day, Daniel called again. No answer. He called again, the day after. Still nothing. It gnawed at him like a splinter buried deep beneath the skin. The silence from the man who had carried his grief so gently now left Daniel with a new kind of restlessness. Couldn't explain it, but he felt responsible. Not in the way one feels obligated, but in the way one feels connected. On the fourth day, Daniel found the courage to search for the number. He knew Michael had once mentioned a small town in Nebraska. That was all he had to go on. He typed the area code into his laptop and cross-referenced what little he remembered Michael's name. A few anecdotes, the mention of an old bookstore. It took him 3 hours, but finally a lead appeared. Michael Grady, retired author, owner of a second-hand bookshop in a town called Wesley Springs. A blog post from 5 years ago mentioned a reading circle he hosted every Wednesday night. There was even a photo, a black and white image of an older man, smiling faintly, standing behind a counter lined with books. It was him. Daniel was sure of it. The bookstore's website still existed, barely updated, but a landline number was listed. He called. A woman answered. Wesley Books, she said politely. Hiya, I'm trying to reach Michael Grady. Is he available? There was a long pause. Too long. Who's calling? The woman asked. My name is Daniel. I've been speaking with him by phone the past few weeks. We've become friends. I haven't heard from him, and I'm just concerned. The woman's voice softened. He hasn't been in the store for a few days. We've tried checking. He lives alone. And, well, sometimes he disappears when things get heavy. He's like that. Is he okay? Daniel asked, heart pounding. We don't know, she said gently. But if he told you something, you may know more than we do. That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, staring at the photo he'd printed from the bookstore blog. He remembered Michael's voice, the warmth, the patience, the sorrow beneath the surface. And then he did something that surprised even himself. He packed a small bag. He was going to Wesley Springs. The drive was long, nearly 2 days across. Several states, but Daniel didn't care. For the first time since Emily's passing, he felt a pull stronger than grief. He was no longer running from his pain. He was reaching through someone else's. When he arrived, Wesley Springs was quiet and dusted with the golden haze of late autumn. The kind of town where people still nodded at strangers and dogs lay sunbathing on porches. He found the bookstore easily. The closed sign hung crooked on the front door. Dust lined the windows and through the glass. Rows of books waited patiently for someone to turn their pages. He knocked anyway. No answer. But just as he turned to leave, a voice called out from down the sidewalk. You looking for Michael? Daniel turned. It was a man, maybe in his 60s, walking with a cane and a worn hat. Yes, he hasn't returned my calls. I was worried. The man nodded slowly. You must be the one from the phone. Oh. Daniel froze. He told you about me? Man smiled sadly. He tells stories more than he shares facts. But he spoke of a voice that helped him remember how to feel again. Said it was like hearing his son in another life. Daniel's throat tightened. I didn't know he had a son. The man looked away, then back. He did. Lost him 15 years ago. Car crash. They'd had a fight the week before and didn't speak again. Michael blamed himself for years. Never forgave himself. That's when he started the calls. What calls? The man pointed toward the bookstore window. Used to keep a list of numbers from conferences, retreats, events anyone he'd met. Started calling strangers once a week. Said if he could be the voice someone needed, maybe it would mean something. Daniel stood in silence. It all made sense now. Michael had been healing himself by healing others. Do you know where he is now? Daniel asked. The man hesitated. He has a cabin up near Maple Ridge by the lake. When the world gets too loud, he goes there. Daniel left immediately. The drive to the cabin was steep and winding. Pines lined the road like silent sentinels. By the time he arrived, the sun had dipped below the hills, and twilight bled across the sky. He found the cabin tucked behind a clearing. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney. Daniel approached, uncertain, nervous, but full of resolve. He knocked. A long pause. Then the door creaked open. Michael stood there. Older than the voice Daniel had imagined, his eyes tired but kind. For a moment they simply looked at each other. You came, Michael said. Surprised but not shocked. Daniel nodded. You dropped the call. I couldn't just leave it like that. Michael exhaled slowly. It's been a long time since anyone came for me. And then, for the first time, they stepped into each other's lives, not as voices on a phone, but as two men carrying pieces of each other's stories. Two strangers, bound not by blood or history, but by the invisible thread of shared pain, compassion, and the quiet miracle of showing up. The cabin was warm with the crackling of a slow-burning fire, its scent mingling with the faint aroma of tea. Michael moved slowly, offering Daniel a seat by the hearth, without saying much at first. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a gentle whisper, as if nature itself had paused to listen. I never meant for anyone to come find me, Michael said quietly, his fingers wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug. Especially not you. Daniel watched the older man, saw the weight in his shoulders, the kind of weariness that came not from age, but from carrying things alone for too long. You once said someone saved you by just listening, Daniel replied. You did that. For me, I guess I just wanted to return the favor. Michael looked at him, his eyes damp but unashamed. You're the first person who's tried. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that didn't demand to be filled. And then, slowly, they began to speak. Michael told him everything about his son, Andrew Bright, and wild and passionate. How they had argued the night before the accident over something trivial. How Michael had ignored the last phone call from him, letting it go to voicemail, thinking there would be time, but there wasn't. I listened to that voicemail every day for years, Michael said, voice shaking, till the battery on the old phone died. I couldn't bring myself to charge it again. Daniel didn't speak. He just sat with him, present, open, unafraid of the heaviness. Then Michael said something Daniel never expected. You remind me of him, not in the way you talk or look, but in the way you listen. He had that too. Daniel swallowed the lump rising in his throat. I'm sorry you lost him. Michael nodded. Me too. But in you, somehow, a piece of him came back. I thought I was helping you, but all along you were helping me too. That night, something shifted between them, not as a savior and the saved. Not as one wounded man to another, but as equals. As friends, in the days that followed, Daniel stayed in Wesley Springs. He helped around the bookstore, met the locals, got to know the streets, the small diners, the crooked sidewalks. The town welcomed him not with grand gestures, but with gentle consistencies. Miles. Names remembered. Extra coffee poured without being asked. One evening, Daniel and Michael sat under the stars outside the cabin. I think I'm ready to go. Back home, Daniel said, but I want to do something first. Michael raised an eyebrow. What's that? I want to keep what you started going. Michael smiled faintly. The phone calls? Daniel nodded. You called people who didn't know they needed you? I think maybe there are others like that, people like I was. Lost, numb, hurting in silence. Maybe they just need someone to listen. You sure you're ready? Michael asked. I'm not sure of anything, Daniel said, but I'm willing. So they made a plan. They bought a second-hand phone, created a simple website, and called it One Voice Away. Just a message. If you need someone to talk to, call. No therapy. no judgment, just a human voice. At first, there were only a few calls a week. Some were short, some were silent, okay? Others came from people crying without words. But Daniel was patient. He listened. And slowly, word began to spread. People didn't just want to be heard, they wanted to be seen. And not long after, something remarkable happened. One of the callers, a woman named Laura from Oregon, called back not for help, but to offer herself. As a volunteer, then a man from Detroit, then a retired nurse from Florida. Each had their own pain. Each had found healing, and each wanted to pass it on. Michael watched it grow with quiet pride. But one night, after another long day of phone calls and letters from grateful strangers, Michael sat across from Daniel and said, "I think it's time." "Time for what?" Daniel asked. "For me to rest." Daniel's heart sank. "You're not dying, are you?" Michael laughed softly. "Not today. But I've done what I was meant to do. I carried my grief long enough. And now I've handed the torch to someone who will carry it better than I ever did." Daniel shook his head. "You carried it with more grace than you know." Michael reached into a drawer and pulled out an old phone, the one that had held Andrew's voicemail. He placed it in Daniel's hands. "I finally charged it," he said. "I think it's time I let the message go." Daniel held it carefully, understanding the significance. Together they listened to Andrew's voice, cheerful, full of life. "Hey, Dad. I know we fought, but I just wanted to say I love you. Call me back when you can, okay?" Michael closed his eyes. "I've carried that for 15 years. I think I can finally forgive myself now." Tears rolled down both their faces. That night, Daniel sat alone on the porch as Michael slept. Peacefully inside, he looked up at the stars and felt something he hadn't in months. Peace, not because everything was fixed, but because something real had happened, something lasting. One voice had reached another. One hurting heart had healed another. And now, a circle of kindness had begun that neither of them could ever have imagined. In the weeks that followed, one voice away became more than a phone line. It became a community. A testament to what could happen when one stranger dared to care for another. And Daniel, once broken by grief, found himself whole not because someone saved him, but because someone saw him, listened to him, believed in the light that still flickered inside him. The world didn't change overnight, but one heart did, then another and another. Because sometimes, all it takes is a voice on the phone to remind someone that they are not alone, and that in itself is enough to heal a hurting heart.